Okay, welcome back to The Biology of Kundalini by Jana Dixon, reading and discussion. We're starting on page 14 if you have the book. It is the initiation. So we're going to get started, see how far we can get today in our time allotted. It says spiritual initiation is an event in eros, and like love, cannot be conjured or contrived. It either happens or it doesn't. Kundalini is operating in all of us to a degree. Occasionally, however, it sparks up into what is known as a Kundalini Awakening, transmutation, metamorphosis, transfiguration, spiritual alchemy, or spiritual awakening. In this book, you will see me call this initiation popping, she says. People pop to various degrees. Some fizzle like soda without the cork popping drama of champagne. Others pop spontaneously at 17 years like Ramana Maharishi without any prior spiritual practice. He just read a book on the lives of saints and so identified with them that he practically instantly became one. His experience of going into death was his ego recognizing its own demise as the Atma arose within. That's the spiritual self. Gopi Krishna, there's another recorded writing by Gopi Krishna's awakening. Gopi Krishna's initiation was through meditation, and his was kind of a psychotic sort of situation because he didn't know what was happening. Philip Saint Romain was sparked off through prayer. Mahir Baba awakened when he hit his head with a stone as a boy. Joseph Chilton Pierce popped in his 60s by Shaktipat from Muktananda, one of his teachers. Some spent all their energies in resistance, preventing themselves from the ego death of popping at all, and so never really came alive and lived. As Sir Francis Bacon said, "I do not believe that any man fears to be dead, but only the stroke of death." The Kundalini probably follows the 7-year growth cycles that Joseph Chilton Pierce pointed out. Knowing that there is a lot of subterranean activity going on below the level of conscious registration. For example, we can be heating up for 2 to 3 years without being aware that an awakening is on its way. This is important in watching your people, your family members too. She says, I pop spontaneously at 28 and at 40. If we are uninformed, we will not even know a Kundalini awakening is upon us when it is blasting us full force to kingdom come. We will tend to think it is external conditions that have propelled us into a psychic breakdown or an illness. We normally interpret these intense, rapid initiations as some form of outer interference or outer influence impacting us because of the sudden jump into a different state view, which doesn't appear to be as familiar to us. We are not normally aware that we have an infinitude of windows of being that we can enter in and see out. In my father's house, there are many mansions, many layers of consciousness, many rooms of consciousness. The myriad of factors that contribute to an awakening include higher altitude, air and water quality, diet, exercise, stress, relationships, degree of being on purpose, acts of generosity, risk, adventure travel, exposure to the elements, novelty, new experiences, new environments, the breakdown of habit and torpor, various elemental changes and shock to the body, like alternating hot and cold, like sauna, a cold shower, or light and dark, determination to adhere to soul rather than social conventions, genetics, and both the good and bad conditions of one's upbringing, both stressors and satiety. Other factors include latitude and longitude on the Earth's sphere, because you can get to a particular vortex spot that can pop you. Seasons, sun and moon cycles, chronological, biological age. Some say 40, the midlife crisis is also a spiritual awakening. spiritual practice, having to use a new set of skills, the calling of the muse, and the future time stream. That is the individual eros and perhaps the need of the human species as a whole, expressed through the psychosomatic tension of revelation, known in history as the oracle. It is the differential between old and new growth that initiates the dissolution of the old brain and resurrection of the new. That's really what's going on here. So a rapid growth in cognition, change of environment, or spiritual practice will instigate the new brain development and will bring on awakening. So again, rapid change in cognition. Think of all the ways that can happen. Accidents, education, people, travel, environmental change, and spiritual practice. Okay, those can all initiate this. Since Kundalini is the flow of energy consciousness, areas that promote flow will facilitate an awakening, such as altitude on a mountain, the ions in the air, certain geography that conveys earth currents better. She says, I was pulled to Colorado because I could not pop at sea level in a polluted California city. The summer of 2000 in Boulder was particularly electrical with lots of dry thunderstorms. So thunderstorms, lightning that electrically charges the air. She says in order to initiate a full awakening, I needed the electrically charged air. Of course, she wasn't aware of it at the time, but like the great attractor of the awakening of self, it pulls you both in time and in geography to exactly where you need to be. Also areas with powerful tree growth like the redwoods or the virgin forests. Definitely the moon cycle is involved, hence gravitation plays a big part. Also solar cycles, solar flares, the solar 8-day sector changes affect biological and alchemical processes. The biofields of certain human populations would more or less be conducive to promoting awakenings or not. One needs to have a certain genetic and cellular strength in order for Kundalini to spark up, for it will not ignite in a body that will be greatly damaged by its arousal. So genetic and cellular strength, okay, is required. Kundalini is apt to rise when we increase our vital energy and are relatively block-free. Eating a raw diet, doing yoga, getting plenty of exercise can be contributors. Often there needs to be self-initiatory psychological conditions like devotion, or in Sanskrit we call that bhakti, excessive generosity, or a crisis. It could be a Shaktipat from a guru, again the transmission, or the meeting of a great love in order to set off the chemistry to a high degree of intensity that primes our system. So Shaktipat literally means descent of grace. It is a yogic initiation which the Siddha Guru transmits spiritual energy to the aspirant, thereby awakening the aspirant's dormant Kundalini Shakti. Main Wan Ho suggests that all life is connected by non-local field interpenetration of quantum wave functions. Shaktipat is an example of this effect, while more pronounced when organisms are in each other's presence. It also operates globally and seems to have strange temporal effects also. The interpretation of spiritual energy occurs through quantum waves. So interpenetration of spiritual energy occurs through quantum waves, electromagnetic waves, scalar waves, light waves, acoustic waves, superconduction of consciousness. That is the sympathetic resonance of oscillating systems. That's how Kundalini moves. It moves through the oscillating systems, through the waveforms. To an extent, we're all Shaktipating each other all the time. We live in a world field of this Shaktipat, this transmission of Kundalini. The impact of Shaktipat, or the contagion of spirit between individuals, is endlessly interesting both to consider and experience. The dramatic psychosomatic effects cannot be predicted, but only understood in hindsight. So looking back. The book Spiritual Cannibalism by Rudy is a good account of the potential of spiritual relationship. I know nothing about that book, so I have no idea. She says, I come to the conclusion that Shaktipat is only spiritually moral within an ongoing bonded teacher-pupil relationship where the teacher takes responsibility for the consequences of his or her own actions. So you can receive Shaktipat from a teacher or a transmission and then they don't take any responsibility, and she's saying that's morally wrong. I did receive a Shaktipat of this sorts and was left to fend for myself in that manner, which is why this is such an important subject for me. Kundalini is not about people enjoying each other or themselves. It is about waking up, which most often is a very painful process. Like secondhand smoke, secondhand Kundalini can be very disturbing for people who are observing someone else going through it. If their chemistry is off or their heart is closed, they're going to feel uncomfortable around an individual with awakened Kundalini. I see it all the time in families where they're watching their family member go through an awakening and it's very disturbing to them and they don't understand. And they're in denial usually. Postmenopausal women who are not self-actualized, say you're more dependent type, can be deeply disturbed by the proximity to a younger woman's Kundalini awakening, as the younger woman's chi will revitalize the older woman's hormones, thereby forcing extra growth in a body that is declining in vitality. So, like a younger woman to her mother, the mother might not appreciate being around the awakening daughter for a while. It might be annoying or seemed like it's challenging you. Or just an older woman and a younger woman comes along and maybe she stole your man or whatever, but she's got a Kundalini going, so it's actually initiating a higher state. She says it's unlikely to get Kundalini activity from relationship breakup situations, especially of the fizzle out kind, wrong hormonal components, but getting out of a restrictive or repressive relationship might cause an expansion rather than a contraction of love. And this could stimulate Kundalini and growth. So not necessarily the breakup part, but afterwards, the expansion. Also, unrequited or tragic or thwarted love can be a great promoter of Kundalini because the alchemical conditions are primed for sex and relationship, but that energy is not being used up in the relationship or sex. So instead, the body uses it for metamorphosis. So that's one bonus to unrequited love. This translation of attraction into alchemy is also known as sublimation, using that sexual energy for self. So whether it's consummated or not, romantic interest is a great stimulator of Kundalini because it activates both parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. It increases sex hormones, growth hormones, nitric oxide, and macrophage activity. Thus, the body is primed to pop. The symptoms of being in love, such as acute senses, increased psychic abilities, creativity, wonder, awe, faith, courage, motivation to action, generosity, forgiveness, compassion, all of these are both cause and effect, feeding back into the alchemical loop of priming for the Kundalini, priming the pump of Kundalini, that base root chakra. She says, I think most of our assumptions of sex and relationship are apt to be either wishful thinking or a defense mechanism. She says, love should essentially blow our minds to a deeper reality beyond what we know ourselves or others to be. It's not sex per se that helps trigger Kundalini. It is the vasodilation of the cardiovascular system and the associated introduction of new parasympathetic levels of relaxation into the body-mind. So when you get that really relaxed sensation in like a sexual union, that can help trigger because you're relaxed and receptive. According to an article in Brain Mind Bulletin, Roland McCready and Glenn Rain have found connections between heart patterns and positive emotional states. Normally, chaotic electrocardiogram spectrum patterns become coherent during positive states like falling in love. What initiates Kundalini is therefore the opening of the heart, coupled with a positive state of mind and increased prana flow that comes with being in love. Love in whatever form is transformational, for love is source energy. Kundalini relates to sex in that the sex hormones are the root element of the alchemical process, for you simply don't get an awakening without an elevation of sex hormones. You need those hormones. Also, the nitric oxide that's produced in copious amounts during an awakening from the macrophages and hyperactivated nervous system, nitric oxide, NO, engorges the heart and the sex organs. So the macrophages are producing this when the nervous system is hyperactivated, and that does increase blood flow to the heart and to the sex organs. So since both the parasympathetic and sympathetic of the nervous system are in hyperdrive, one is both hormonally and vascularly opened and ready for super sex. So you can become like hypersexualized during awakening. That's very common also. This occurs during the heating phase of about 2 years prior, and then the 3 years of peak, especially the 6-month peak period. However, this woman says, I never had sex during that time, so I can't say for sure how that would be, but I imagine it's pretty profound, depending on the partner. Since the energy of Kundalini is emergent consciousness itself, it becomes increasingly hard to use it in an unconscious fashion. And that becomes true more and more as you go along. So we're going to read about, she says, is Itzhak Bentov is partly correct. This is, I'm not sure who this is, of Heart Math, I think. When he says that the syncopation of the various oscillating systems in the body amplify energies and increase ionization of the cerebral spinal fluid, conveying a current charge known as Kundalini. Itzhak Bentov's idea is that Kundalini occurs through the micro motion of the body. So it's like this oscillating, and you've heard probably this, oscillation, sort of serpentine-like movement. This model postulates that various body structures can potentially oscillate in sympathetic resonance with each other, leading to the production of an increase in magnetic currents in the cerebral cortex. Bentov correlates this enhanced electromagnetic action in the cortex with Kundalini release. So he says those are correlating. He looks at the body like a mechanical machine, so his physics is surpassed by modern biophysics. She says nowadays we're more apt to look to quantum microtubules, neuron receptors, and neurochemistry for the cause, but the larger electromagnetic and resonant aspects also come into play. And then she talks about Heart Math, the Heart Math Institute, which Greg Braden is a part of, and I definitely learned a little bit from there. You can get on there and they do heart coherence tests. You can get a measuring thing for studying the coherence of your heart, and he gives you simple breathing techniques for bringing your heart into coherence. She says they've done more recent research on the oscillating frequencies of the heart and nervous system. So she directs you to Heart Math's website. So she's speaking about all the initiators for awakening right now. So next she says giving birth and other stressful conditions in which will is overcome often leads to a Kundalini experience. The potent neurological and hormonal mix that is pumped into the body during birthing activates your Kundalini. There's an increase in oxytocin to create the contractions, and both sides of the nervous system are activated, releasing mega opiates and DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which gives you like a bliss experience. Really high experience. Pressure of the baby in the pelvis, muscles charged by exertion, extra breathing, all increases the blood oxygen. CSF, ionized by the heightened condition. Parasympathetic and sympathetic. Liver releases glucose for exertion. All of this is more why Kundalini sparks during birthing. So birthing is definitely a huge time. Christina Groff mentions that Kundalini had arisen during the birthing of her child and was stopped by a morphine injection. So she was aware of that. So during the initiation stage of a full awakening, we can assume the thyroid and the parathyroid glands are hyperactive. So you might have thyroid issues starting to flare if you're in a Kundalini awakening. So just to be aware, it's interesting to note hyperparathyroidism increases the ionized calcium in the cerebral spinal fluid, causing some sort of psychotic symptoms. The parathyroid governs extracellular calcium levels. It could be a unique combination of oxygen intake, hormonal levels, and activation of the sympathetic nervous system that creates the initial spark of the spine. So you have to be careful with some of these symptoms and going and running and getting stuff for them, because it's important to know if they're part of a bigger biological process going on, right? Just like we spoke about in the first video, if you didn't know what puberty was, no one was there to tell you, and you suddenly like started to, as a girl, grow breasts, and you thought something was wrong with you, and so you went and they're like, oh my gosh, it's a growth, let's have it cut off, but you didn't know what was going to happen, or you had something suppress it. Sudden stress or relief of prolonged stress can bring on a Kundalini awakening. Whether it's the stress of recognition of the self through contact with a guru or finding true love, she quotes, when the senses are heightened because of stress, novelty, or fear, it is much easier to become a mystic or feel ecstasy or fall in love. This is by Diane Ackerman in A Natural History of Love. She also says danger makes one more receptive to romance. Danger is an aphrodisiac. So stress, even the stress of new growth, can trigger the hypertonality of the sympathetic nervous system, allowing Kundalini to spark. So PTSD, interestingly enough, post-traumatic stress disorder, can also be a preparatory factor to Kundalini triggering, because the PTSD represents an accumulation of the suspension of the arousal cycle. An accumulation of the suspension of the arousal cycle. The pressure of the frozen fight or flight response that is caught in the nervous system creates an inefficiency which the organism tries to eliminate through the complete discharge of the energy in a Kundalini awakening, thereby allowing the nervous system to heal. So accumulated PTSD can be a pre-Kundalini initiate moment. So we aren't going to get through this entire chapter. Ooh, we'll get close here. In my experience, she says, the initial spark up the spine can occur out of the blue. Kundalini can occur even quite later in life, but usually in someone who's already psychically sensitive and mystically aware. She says that hers occurred in association with stress and stress relief, longing, and fulfillment. But we have to be on our edge. They don't occur in dull, satiated, and ordinary periods of one's life. My first awakening arose through stress, overt generosity, and biological precognition of my father's imminent death. The second, through my love for Mr. Universal and the muse's insistence that I write a book on metamorphosis. So those were the things that triggered her. Though no matter what the trigger, the awakening of Kundalini seems as inevitable and as natural as breathing. It is as though an inexpressible question in us, an ineffable drive has to be answered. The restless search ends as we surrender to the Maker and come home to ourself. Since Kundalini awakening is most often just something that happens, we don't have a lot to say in how mature we are when it strikes. However, by its very extreme nature, Kundalini will force greater maturity and lucid adjustment to reality in order to survive. Along with the sense of danger inherent in the dissolving of one's known self, there is also a buoyant faith that arises from being so lit with spirit and at one with the universe. So even if your world's falling apart, there is a lightness about you. Kundalini arousal and the ongoing development of the nervous system makes us more sensitive to the inner and outer worlds. The self-directed force of Kundalini purifies accumulated stresses caused by past habits and traumas. Friction and difficulty during our awakening occur not so much from the process itself, but from our conscious and our unconscious interference with it due to not understanding what's going on. So really our interference is unconscious, or we don't want it to happen, or we're not really sure, or there's some outer resistance, right, from our past or traumas. She says Kundalini burns off much of the primary reactivity imprinted from our family of origin. So the family might have a hard time with your awakening as old family known patterns burn off. With Kundalini, the opportunity for change is increased because our neurological slate is wiped relatively clean. But it depends on our faith, our will, and environment as far as how fast we can grow. If we do not change our habits to reflect the self's true interests, we will continue to rebuild the conditioned, reactive self we thought ourselves to be before this ever happened. Now we have to think we spend our entire lives thinking that we are this entity created by our parents and our culture, but are we really that entity? I mean, they don't really even know us. They only know our projection, their projection of us, right? The grail, of course, is the true self that is beyond all such impositions. Kundalini is the consciousness in matter becoming more conscious of itself. Therefore, if one wants to evolve, such an awakening is necessary. And by that, it means grow, become more of yourself. Or rather, evolution and awakening simply are, and we surrender to this reality or we fight it. Sometimes we have a rocky time of it because awakening is always moving us through uncharted territory, and because we exist in a civilization still based on fibs and repression and inertia. If we didn't get so contracted and arrested while forming, then the Kundalini would go through its cycle without fireworks, because there would be fewer boulders to the flow to create friction and the damming of energy. So detoxification is always the first thing to aim for in any spiritual endeavor, and it is especially important prior to a Kundalini awakening. So if you sense this is near, then I would get into a detox program. In fact, because it's so detoxifying, switching to a raw diet will probably lead to a Kundalini awakening, she's saying. She does not recommend drug use for triggering Kundalini, although that can do so, like plant medicines. She says it's hard enough to handle by itself without trying to bring it on, but anyone who does detoxify, exercise, strengthen, impassion, and enthuse will bring on increased Kundalini. If you're interested in a more intimate relationship with your maker and a desire to be overwhelmed in love with the beloved, then yes, Kundalini is likely to naturally arise from your heart and spirit attuning to such. We are naturally told what to do to come into alignment with the self through this process. The desire will and carry, the desire will and carry through just needs to be there. She needs a comma there. The desire, comma, will, comma, and carry through just need to be there, along with faith to proceed despite all appearances and setbacks. Prior to the obvious activation of Kundalini, various strange symptoms can occur for years prior. For example, she says her left shin became really sore for a year before 1998 awakening. She used to rub rosemary into it. Kundalini shows up mostly in the left side of the body, and you know it is obviously Kundalini when you feel the tingle at the bottom of the left foot. Although if one looks back, one can see various warning signs. I definitely had like a left ear, my whole left side of my head, I couldn't hear. And then I remember it was in 2007, it was like every time I listened to someone through my left ear, it was like I could hear their inner child talking, and then I would come over here and it was different. It was like a weird little phase. If one looks back, you can see various things. So that is, we go from consensus worldview and material understanding to a vastly new universe in a matter of seconds as the energy shoots through the body like 1,000 suns. Another sign that an awakening is on the way is the front of the neck around the thyroid might become painful for years. That happened to me, I mentioned. We can also experience years of painful contractions in the inner core as though a rubber band was getting tighter and tighter within us. That can be part of the vagus nerve. If the mind is healthy, a handy tool for integration of the transmutation. So a healthy mind helps. The mind, if unhealthy or weak, is increasingly disturbed by the rising of this energy, such that an individual might be even less adapted to the consensual reality. So correct use of the mind can perfect the body, open the heart, provide a strong nervous system, and this will allow the awakening to proceed in a rather healthy manner rather than a pathological manner. The heightened psychic insight, sensory awareness of activated Kundalini can make one more sane in the cosmic or universal sense than the consensus trance of conventional reality, but more easily triggered into a dramatic action as well, because everything in the psyche and soma is less repressed. So one becomes more godlike, you could say, and more like elemental and archetypal, but that might make them seem to flare up or be triggered more because they're less apt to like stand for what's going on in the world. So the barrier between material and spiritual becomes more permeable as the consciousness expands into regions that you couldn't access before. She says, during heightened Kundalini, I have increased precognition and non-local information activity. I had that as well, I told you, and it lasted about only a few months for me, the 6-month period maybe. It is no longer surprising as it is the first nature to me now. She says, I can also turn my stereo on and start the CD in my sleep during high spiritual energy periods. I did it recently when I was working on a piece of writing in my dreams. The spontaneous turning on of the CD player always happens at 3 a.m., perhaps because the body's circuits must change from sleeping to waking, and the flipping of the brain frequencies turns on the stereo. However, it doesn't happen with light fixtures. Now, some people can like turn on lights or blow out their computers during their heightened Kundalini stage. She says, I've learned not to get overly emphatic about psychic level information because it will come in and out. She says it's just a reaffirmation of the mysterious nature of the universe. It gives me hope for the future of humanity. Someone with a more active Kundalini is more elemental and archetypal. However, the reduction in the adaptive cognition can be so great that one can't drive a car. So you can be really like expanded and then, but also not be able to access normal stuff for a time. In hostile social environments, these emotions that you might feel during, okay, so let me back up because I'm skipping ahead because I'm noticing we're at 33 minutes, but let me just slow down. There are periods when the cerebral cortex is greatly incapacitated, okay, while the limbic and autonomic brains are hyperactivated. So as the repressive mechanism of the ego is reduced during the stages, there's a purging of primitive emotions. So you might not have shame, guilt, fear, panic, paranoia, depression, self-pity. If you're in a hostile social situation, that can be detrimental or catastrophic. You know, if the emotional cathartic development is suspended and not able to run its course, then someone might put you in a mental institution. And I know of that happening. I've known it to happen to several people. And I try to work with the families on understanding what's going on. And one reason why I want to share this with you, and I'm going to stop right there, is because it's so important that the families and that we all start to understand what this process is, so that we, a lot of people want to just write it off. Well, that sounds all nice and good, but I don't think so. I've never heard of this before, or that can't be right, or I don't know what you're talking about, or that just sounds like flu. So I'm sharing this with you because I have seen it in play many times. I've experienced it many times. I know many people have gone through this. I've studied this for a long time, personally, and in the East where it's normal. And to bring this information to the West, I think, is crucial, because we're in a crisis state of awakening now. There is a mass awakening, and it's going to continue as people pop more and more. So let's learn how to deal with this together as humanity. So I'll be back again tomorrow to read more of The Biology of Kundalini, Exploring the Fire of Life by Jana Dixon, one of the greatest textbooks I know on the subject. You can find it free online at lulu.com, L-U-L-U, or you can go ahead and pick a copy up. This is her first volume, and yeah, we'll see you again tomorrow.